Daniel 2 is the first chapter in the book of Daniel that's not written in Hebrew. It's written in Aramaic, which was used as a sort of a common language, a lingua franca during this period. That's important. Why? Well, the fact is, you've got what's known as a chiastic structure. Don't panic, I'll explain it. In the next few chapters of Daniel. What that means is you've got one chapter at the start mirroring a chapter at the end of that section, and then the second one in mirrors the second to last, and the third one in mirrors the third from last, and so on. So chapter 2 is a statue dream about 4 kingdoms. And chapter 7, Daniel has a vision of his own about 4 kingdoms. Rising of a set of 4 mutant beasts there again from a tumultuous sea. And chapter 3 is about 3 faithful Jews being challenged over their faithfulness. And chapter 6 is about Daniel in the lion's den being challenged over his faithfulness. You see, the themes are mirroring. You've got dung, 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 these chapters going along, and this one mirrors that one, and the next one in mirrors the next one in, and the next one in mirrors the next one in, and that's how it goes, a chiastic structure. And the whole of that is actually given to us in Aramaic, not the Hebrew. So the book starts in Hebrew along, you go, whoops, all of a sudden we're in Aramaic. And as soon as that structure I've been talking about ends, it goes back into Hebrew again. So the whole thing is being signaled then by the switch into this common language of Aramaic. And contrary to popular opinion, the primary purpose of this chapter is not to showcase the fact that Daniel is better than the best of Babylon, great guy, though undoubtedly he was, but to highlight the absolute supremacy of his God. Here in this chapter 2, God is absolutely supreme in the area of knowledge and understanding. Then in the next chapter 3, God is absolutely supreme in the area of his power, and so on. Well, Daniel 2 starts this section and indicates it by the switch of the language. And this chapter is really then about God's superior knowledge and eternal rule, his eternal kingdom over against the wickedness and arrogance of violent human kings. God is greater than these powerful rulers, here in his wisdom, next in his absolute power. It's here in Daniel 2 that over against all the massive Babylonian wisdom and power that's on display, God is going to prove that he has superior knowledge and is the source of knowledge. And it's being manifested, that knowledge, through those who trust in him. So if you want to know the heart of this chapter 2 of Daniel, the point of it, you go to Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 to 28. Daniel replied, that is, he spoke to the king. We'll get to that. He replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Key to understanding this chapter. You can't, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and Daniel says, well, in this dream, God has shown Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in your bed are these, he says, and he tells him the dreams. We'll see why that is particularly important. And 3 themes keep coming clearly as we go through the chapter: the sovereignty of God, the pride of human kings and rulers, arrogance characterizing human actions, and the tension created for God's faithful people by living in the service of a God who is sovereign, while under the confusing earthly reign of a godless and arrogant human king. Why did that happen? What a mystery. And we'll see those 3 themes that are set out in this chapter. They recur throughout the rest of the book. So, Daniel, foreign captive living in a pagan court, outshining the regular staff in that court as he interprets the dream that the locals couldn't interpret, doing it far better than the home team could even think of doing. But the key point in all of that is not about what Daniel is like, but about what Daniel's God is like, as Daniel in verse 27 himself makes explicit. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. There's the challenge of this chapter for us. Can we live confidently under the government we've got? And can we live in confusing situations of all sorts? Why is God doing that? Why is God allowing that? Can we live in that sort of time where there are perplexing and confusing situations of all sorts that are simply a mystery to us? And can we live through those faithfully because we know we serve a God who reveals mysteries? A God with absolute knowledge and understanding, and who does actually, at the right time and in the right way, reveal mysteries, even if it feels like it was the last minute. Well, we've mentioned already then the first thing we notice here in verses 1 to 11 of chapter 2 of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar has inferior knowledge. And we're going to see that's because the team he's batting for, the gods and the religion and whatever that he's batting for, is inferior. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, at this stage, he's in the very early years of his reign, and there's a sense that he doesn't trust his enchanters and soothsayers very much at all yet. And so when he has this dream, he therefore asks for something from them that is utterly unparalleled in Babylonian literature and culture. The suggestion is that he needs to know if they are the genuine article, these interpreters and knowledge people and all the rest of it, these wisdom seekers, or if they're stringing him along. And the deal seems to be that he tells them a dream, they come up with some reassuring or heartwarming garbage, and no, says Nebuchadnezzar. He is not up for that sort of game. His word is firm, certain or definite, he says in verse 5. They've got to tell him what the dream was. And then he'll feel reassured that the interpretation they go on to offer is a reliable interpretation. And if they don't, he says he will cut them in pieces. What a lovely guy. Well, the sad thing for them is, of course, they've got every reason to believe him when he says that. But what he's asking for is not how these guys worked, had ever worked, or ever could work. This is beyond the scope of their competence, which is the point. How's that? There's a lot in the ancient text to show that these guys had two sorts of things they studied in order to be able to predict the future from those things. One was in observable material phenomena, looking at things that happened in the stars, the planets, freak weather events happening in the world, finding particular things in the entrails of animals that they cut up, and so on. And they got volumes and volumes of literature to look up to tell them that in the past, something or other they saw in the entrails of a rabbit took place at such and such a time when such and such was happening. And from that, they would predict what is going to happen again then. That's how they worked. They studied all these books. It was like science to them. They really had a lot of data. This was all their wisdom and all their learning. So when they themselves wanted to know about something, they'd go and cut up a rabbit, or other animals were available, get their books and look at what they had to say. This was their highest level of science and proof. But they also had a lower level, which was significant seeming dreams. Now that seemed to them to be all subjective. It was all in your mind and in your emotions and so on. Not like having, the guts of a rabbit to have a look at. But dreams, they felt, were notoriously tricky to pin down. And when they thought they'd worked out what a dream might be about, they'd go and cut up some poor unsuspecting animal or take some astronomical observations just to confirm things before they placed any decent level of confidence against the interpretation of the dream. Or maybe in fact just wrote it off as having had too much cheese to eat in the evening before. But they needed to be told the dream. That was their process, you see. And then they'd go and cut up a rabbit. They needed to be told the dream. Therefore, to take along their scientific process as that was the whole basis on which their system worked. And without it, they had nothing to offer, nothing to give. Unless you told them the dream, they had nothing to work with. So Nebuchadnezzar's request for the interpretation without the dream is completely unprecedented in their experience and in the whole of Babylonian literature. So they go back to Nebuchadnezzar in verses 4 and 7 of chapter 2 of Daniel, and they take him head on in verses 10 to 11 as well. And on all those occasions, they're saying he's being utterly impossible with them. Quite a risk, but they've been put in a place that for them is quite desperate anyway. So they go back and they protest in those three places, verse 4, 7, and then 10 to 11. Hear this. This is verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, there is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. Now this is really important. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked for any such thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. Now listen to this. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. Now there's the thing. No one can do that apart from the gods, and they don't live among humans. There's the thing, because Daniel's God does just that. He is the God who reveals mysteries. We know why. He has got superior knowledge, and he does move amongst human beings. He comes to us. So what does that say about the focus of young Daniel's devotion? Well, there lies the very heart of what this book is telling us in this chapter. The God of the Bible does reveal what are mysteries to even the best of Babylon. And he's to be trusted, to be relied upon as God because he does so. And Daniel is going to put his life on the line for that truth, in that trust. See, there is the full-throated admission of the impotence of human wisdom from the Babylonian enchanters and astrologers and whatever they are. The limit of human wisdom and understanding in this fallen and often confusing world before God for you. Now bear in mind, Daniel and his friends were dealing with the confusion caused by the tension between their faith that God was sovereign and their experience as captives from Israel in brutal Babylon. And that hard, conflicted experience was mitigated by their knowledge, not of the so-called learned books of the Babylonians, but by their knowledge of the person of the one true living God. He reveals mysteries, and on him they do rely. But human understanding has got nothing to offer in the darkness of human uncertainty. And that is the key issue Daniel 2 is addressing for us. Humanity's in this position, in their secular, scientific sort of mindset. They say what the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, but they do, and they do not live among humans. But there is a God, and there is Daniel's God, and he is cut from a very different cloth. That we're jumping the gun, okay? These guys who were protesting they were being asked the impossible were Babylon's best. But when they were challenged by the king for knowledge, incontrovertible knowledge, because they could tell the dream without being told it, they had nothing. And when the king is thwarted by the limitations of the human knowledge and human wisdom that he is able to muster, the immature and far too over-promoted young king blows up in some style. And he does so in sheer contrast with Daniel, who in the teeth of the king's threats against the Babylonian wise guys, bear in mind, Daniel and his friends have all been put in there, in that group of Babylonian wise guys. They've all been put there to study the books and all that. In sheer contrast to those guys, who are also subject to the king's threats against them, Daniel keeps his calm perfectly. And he does so throughout. So first of all, Nebuchadnezzar is kind of putting on display his inferior knowledge and the inferior knowledge of the people he's got working for him. And secondly, Nebuchadnezzar reacts against being confronted with that inferior knowledge. And he does that in verses 12 to 16. And the slaughter begins. Daniel is not remotely panicked by the widespread slaughter of the people around him as the king's wrath starts getting worked out. And as Arioch, the king's hatchet man, comes to the door, Daniel takes hold of him and he says, "What's this all about?" And Arioch explains, and Daniel does a bit of an Esther really by boldly going into the king for a quiet word. Now, bear in mind that's really risky. Daniel wasn't allowed, we're told earlier on, in chapter 1, we're told he wasn't allowed to stand before the king until he'd had 3 years of training in this wisdom of the Babylonians. He couldn't go into the king. All the divination stuff in their books about stars and animal entrails, he'd have to study those for 3 years. And he'd only had 2. But Daniel trusts in the sovereignty of the God who reveals mysteries more than he fears the wrath of the irascible king of Babylon. So verse 16, at this Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. That's bold faith in that sort of context. But that extra time had been refused to the fully fledged cream of Nebuchadnezzar's wise men crop. We don't know why Daniel gets the extra time, but he does. And what we realize here is that Babylonian experts have just got the books of empirical data produced over hundreds of years of study. That's simply inadequate. But Daniel is a person of the presence of God who reveals mysteries. That's faith, you see, in the one true living God for you. You live on the fact, at risk of the fact, that there is one true living God and that he delights to reveal mysteries. Now, why did Arioch, the executioner who had come to kill him, listen to Daniel and allow this to happen? How did Daniel gain access to the king? If the king was so raging mad, how did Daniel get his extra time? There's a ton of stuff in this section we're just not told. In fact, of all the spoken words that could have been reported to tell us what was going on, that would have filled in so much of the background we might want to know, there's only one bit of direct conversation reported, and that's where Daniel asks Arioch the executioner, verse 15, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? And Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. There's any direct speech there. That's all we know of what actually really is being reported to us of what went on. Well, of course, Daniel is the key operator here. He's the only one allowed to speak. He's the wise one, the calm one. He's living in the tension between the sovereignty of God and the threat posed by living under this brutal human ruler, Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel at this time has got enough questions of his own. But what we see here is Daniel stepping aside of all his confusion to act in the confidence that his God is the one who reveals mysteries. Not when I want him to, but when the time is right. Confidence, very importantly, in the God he knows. He is the God who reveals mysteries. So now Daniel, he gets his mates involved in it, takes all of this to God in prayer. He's got his time. Now he needs to know about the dream. So Daniel, thirdly then, verses 17 to 23, goes to God. Can you see here in these verses, verses 17 to 23 of Daniel 2, can you hear what Daniel says to God to get the Lord to intervene? What's the technique of his prayer? What do we discover about the essential elements of urgent prayer when the world around us is just wild? How do we pray? What's the correct form? Well, if we go and look at Daniel 2, 17 to 23, the answer is obvious. We're not told what he prays. We're not told the content of his prayer at all. What we are told is the spirit in which he prayed. And that's a very important distinction. How does he pray? Key concepts to describe what we know of the spirit in which he prayed would be words like calm, confident, corporate, together. But on the other hand, we are told what constitutes the content of Daniel's thanksgiving afterwards. Key themes in this great doxology we've got, great song of praise we've got in verses 20 to 23, that follows the Lord revealing the content and the meaning of the dream as God reveals this particular high tension mystery, would be, well, okay, let's just listen. I'll read that for you, verses 20 to 23. Daniel gets the answer and he goes, praise, he hasn't gone into the king yet. He's just got the knowledge. Praise be to the name of God for ever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. That's what it's all been about. God is the one who knows and reveals. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. That's going to be a major theme in the book of Daniel. That's what the dream's been about. You see, the four kingdoms of men and the one of the rock. Daniel praises on. He gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You've given me wisdom and power. See, they weren't looking back over history the way the Babylonians were to see what world events coincided with what cropping up in the gut of a rabbit or in the stars or whatever else. They're going on the way God in the past has dealt with his people in relationship with them. And I praise you, I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, he says then. You have given me wisdom and power. You've made known to me what we asked of you. You've made known to us the dream of the king. Oh, full of praise, isn't he? God's sovereignty, right to rule, eternal kingdom, that he raises mere human kings up and brings them down. He reveals deep and hidden knowledge. A lot of the themes in this doxology are the themes not just of this chapter, but of the whole book. And the dream is about God raising up kings and taking them down in a context where the king is pretty awful and threatening. So it's about God having done what he does and reveals this mystery. Now then, he's got the dream revealed to him. That's the third thing we notice in this passage. Fourth thing, Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar with an unexpected message. Verses 24 to 30. So here in these verses 24 to 30, this is the climax of the chapter. This is what resolves the tensions in the confusing and frightening situation. Telling and interpreting the dream. It means that the death threat against Daniel and his friends is removed, and it solved the tension of the king not knowing what the dream meant. So this section is the climax and the resolution then of what's been confused and complicated earlier on. Daniel goes to Arioch once he knows the dream. Arioch takes Daniel in to see the king again, and Arioch is obviously absolutely convinced already that Daniel's cracked it, because Arioch promptly tries to take the credit for it all, but we'll pass that to one side. Anyway, verse 26, the king asks Daniel if he can come up with the cookies, and Daniel is not going to get it straight to the delivery of cookies. He's going to make a few points first along the way. He makes very sure he takes the time to make God look good in the whole matter. God has got to look good in this. This is not about Daniel, and Daniel is absolutely certain he's going to show it. Verses 27 to 28, Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these." And he goes on and he tells the king. So what goes on here then? Daniel's gone in. What does he do? He affirms the things the Babylonian wise men had said about the king asking the impossible of humans, but also he says that there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. My God does the impossible. That's Daniel's first point. And then the second point, Daniel's second point, is that this interpretation does not come about because of anything special about Daniel. Daniel gives God all the glory, and he's very careful to do it. He does that because there's a living God who's watching. Verses 29 to 30. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries, God, he showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me. God has told me. Not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation, that you may understand what went through your mind. And under temporary stay of execution, Daniel is obviously under no hurry here. He's in no hurry. He's not rushing into the king's presence saying, I got it, it means this. No, he's not doing that. Daniel sees that it is not telling the dream that's the important thing here, but that Nebuchadnezzar should be almost compelled to acknowledge that Daniel's God has the power, because he really does know everything. And it is Daniel's God who reveals knowledge. Only eventually does Daniel get to telling what the dream was about. The dream, Daniel perceives, is not the big point God wants to make. The big issue to get across to the king is who God is and the difference he makes in situations of painful and terrible not knowing to the people who know and put their trust in him. Who he is. He's the one who reveals mysteries. The difference he makes in situations of painful and terrible not knowing. And who he makes that known to, who he makes that difference for, the people who know and put their trust in him. So fifthly, and this is almost the minor point in the end of the chapter, verses 31 to 45, Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar with an unexpected assertion, the stuff about the four kings and the stone. The interpretation of the kingdoms, the business of trying to pry into identifying the kingdoms and which were they and so on in past history, it's attracted a lot of attention. It's caused a spilling of much ink, but that is really not the point of this chapter at all. It's not about that. The golden head is identified for us as Nebuchadnezzar in that dream. And the stone at the end, that's at the beginning, and the stone at the end is the kingdom of God. But beyond that lies total speculation. We don't know, we're not told. Wonder why we're not told. Because the God who reveals mysteries deems it not important for us to know the details of what those intervening kingdoms are. He needs us to know, Nebuchadnezzar, you're that gold head, but look, you're supported on a whole lot of stuff that ends up with feet of clay. But God is the one who brings down human kings who get arrogant and misuse the power that they're allowed. So, the dream really is about the theme of the doxology. that God raises kings up and takes them down, that he is sovereign, and despite the ruthlessness and violence of the kingdoms of men, the behavior of their rulers, they are all in his hand. But God is the one who reveals the mystery of these things. He's the one who deals with the tension by making plain, in his time, in his purpose, to his people who put their trust in him. So in conclusion, in verses 46 to 49, the chapter winds up with Nebuchadnezzar summarizing verbally the message we're supposed to be getting out of the chapter. King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel, it says in verse 46, paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. And the king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Point made and point taken by Nebuchadnezzar, the violent, murderous, idolatrous, godless ruler. Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. Your God is above all these deities we're making such a fuss about. And he's the Lord of kings. He's above guys like me, says Nebuchadnezzar. And he reveals mysteries because you were able to reveal this mystery, whereas the gods of the Babylonians could not. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position, lavished many gifts on him, made him ruler of the entire province of Babylon, placed him in charge of all its wise men. Daniel asks if his mates Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can get, prominent positions as administrators over the province of Babylon. Yes, yes, yes. They go off into the provinces, and Daniel himself remains at the court. Daniel gets recognized as a genuine representative of Daniel's God, and there's a massive message here for God's people under pressure everywhere, struggling to stay faithful to the apparent contradiction between their current hard experience and God's sovereignty. Look, when God does God stuff and reveals mysteries, displaying superior knowledge to anything Babylon has come across, Nebuchadnezzar actually bows down, paying homage before the foreign and captive servant of this apparently defeated God that Nebuchadnezzar's armies have bashed up. They've been taken captive from defeated Israel to Babylon. The apparently but not actually defeated God is the one who in fact is all wise, who knows everything, reveals relevant mysteries to his faithful people. How encouraged must Daniel and his mates themselves have been that God breaks through mysteries and that he, the rock, brings up and puts down the seemingly powerful human authorities that cause them so much pain and trouble. The question for us is this. You watch the news. How does it make you feel? Particularly at this moment in time. How are we to live in this troubled and troubling world, where the enemies of God cause us such pain and confusion, and we are often in confusion as to what God is doing and why? More explicitly, how do we live here as followers of the sovereign God, who actually we do know he does reveal mysteries? If we trust him to be sovereign and to take care of and to reveal the things we just don't understand, often not at our leisure, but in the nick of time, as here, where Arioch the executioner had already arrived at the door, then how calm and confident and controlled will that teach us to be if we know we serve the God who reveals mysteries? When we go into this or that situation of challenge or difficulty, my God reveals the mysteries here. And knowing that, believing that, understanding that, what impact will that have on the way we handle the things that today confuse us and trouble us? See, the key to developing such an automatic pattern of response, such a disposition as we see in Daniel and these guys, it lies in laying hold of, grasping and feeding our souls before the day of challenge, before the time of calamity, feeding them on the characteristics and the character of God. Daniel's refuge is in the God that he knows God to be. He's the God who reveals mysteries. And they're the character and characteristics of God that you'll find in Daniel's description of the God who reveals mysteries in his praise part at the end of the chapter there, towards the end there. And the key to it is living as people who by basic and automatic disposition live life as reliance on and trust in the God who reveals the things we can't understand and is to be trusted until in his good time he does so. Because all the while, he is the one with superior knowledge. And as we may well see shortly, in chapter 3, the one with superior knowledge and power. God bless you
Yeah.
as you trust in Him, the God who reveals mysteries, this week.